Wonderful day, wonderful day, wonderful day indeed. This is your neighborhood sensei Fouché, and I begin all my shows by first strongly suggesting, because a lot of folks don't like being told what to do, true indeed. So, in forward communication, I most emphatically implore for all of you beautiful, wonderful, self-loving, worthy individuals to stay woke. But in the meantime, never let them get you all stressed out. You know what I'm saying? Make sure you take any necessary meditative steps, practices, and procedures, including environmental change, if and when necessary, to relax. And like myself, always be prepared to take those notes. And today is the 14th of August, 2025. And there's always things going on, as we well know, every single day. You know, when you are alert, it's easy to be convinced to go to sleep. And then that's neglect and possible abuse for yourself. You know, being unaware leaves you susceptible to be fooled into accepting someone else's abuse. And the idea is to be informative into who we really are. In that education and transparency, we gain strength within to have the courage to stand up for ourselves and no longer accept being abused. Psychologically, emotionally, physically, either and or all of the above. Here at this Stay Woke with Sensei Fouché platform, we are all about information. And our primary information is heightening our understanding of self-worth and value. All the rest of this political and social issues outside of ourselves, that information is very important in the terms of interdependent existence. Without our inner strength and moral foundation, we are strongly susceptible to be convinced that it's okay for someone else to abuse us. And that is because we have no self-value or worth. And that lacking, again, makes us easy targets to be used and manipulated. And I know I value myself. I used to not value myself, and the first thing you always do in those circumstances is self-affliction, self-harm through many different varieties. Mine was drug and extreme alcohol abuse, hard drug and extreme alcohol abuse. And that's going to lead us into what we're covering in this 6th chapter, because I was going to state before interceding about being an internalizer. And within my internalizing process of behavior, I chose to use as my coping mechanism for depression extreme alcohol and strong drug abuse. I mean, it would be easy to go and externalize and lash out at someone else. But in my processing and avoidance into a different kind of legal direction, I chose self-mutilation or self-harm, self-abuse. And we're covering this book, Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents. I replace parents with people. Anyone that's been following would know that. By Lindsay C. Gibson. How to heal from distant, rejecting, or self-involved people. And just for the introduction of the novel, I first used the word parents. But in most specific reference, this is directed into the most informative instruction to define these different behaviors of people in this interrelated world. Because isolation, that doesn't work, but we're not going to talk about that specifically at this moment. Was your parent difficult, immature, or emotionally unavailable? If you grew up with an emotionally immature, unavailable, or selfish parent, you may have lingering feelings of anger, loneliness, betrayal, or abandonment. You may recall your childhood as a time when your emotional needs were not met, when your feelings were dismissed, or when you took on adult levels of responsibility in an effort to compensate for your parents' behavior. These wounds can be healed, and you can move forward in your life. We're in the middle of chapter 6. This is part 2 in conversation to chapter 6. What it's like to be an internalizer. And we're going to get right into it. I didn't want to go too much into an opening monologue. We're going to get right into it. There's so much depth to cover, and we're midway through the entire novel in discussion, in shared discussion. Internalizers become invisible and easy to neglect. And I wanted to rip this show a little bit earlier, or a few days earlier, but moments are moments, and we're in this moment, so I feel honored in moving forward into our informative information and defined lessons. Externalizers are the easy children to spot in a family system. A kid who blows up over nothing. a teenager who keeps getting into trouble, an adult child who causes problems. Whatever their issues, externalizers are always the ones in the foreground of their parents' concern. Their parents devote more energy and worry to them than their other kids. Sip of water. It's extremely important. Internalizers often appear to need less attention and nurturance, excuse me, than externalizers because they rely on their inner resources. They're not trying to feel like they're bothering or overwhelming someone else with their problems, whereas externalizers really don't care, you know what I'm saying? Because it's more about lashing out, you know what I'm saying, rather than being emotionally over invested into your feelings to a particular situation. They're embarrassed to ask for help and instead try to solve problems on their own. They hate to feel like a bother. For busy or preoccupied parents, this self-reliance may invite neglect, which means the parents thinking that everything's okay, you know, it's easy to practice neglect, not even knowing the extreme development, you know, that neglect is going to cause further, you know what I'm saying? Because, you know, the victim, the child, is really acting like everything is okay, you know what I'm saying? Because they're internalizers, you know, so it's kind of masked unless the parent is most intuitive or inquisitive into specific reactions that doesn't seem like it follows in a confident direction or a secure direction. You know what I'm saying? Then you're gonna, you know, dig a little bit more into questioning and finding out truly how the child would feel, as opposed to how they're maybe making it seem to you how they feel, minimizing, you know, the height of their hurt. This makes them low-maintenance children who are easy to overlook. For busy or preoccupied parents, this self-reliance may invite neglect, which I was stating before. Parents may think their child is getting by just fine without much attention. Indeed, self-contained internalizers do seem to get by on less attention. I was just stating this before. And I only know this so well because this is me. You know what I'm saying? I could tell this to you without reading it, but for the sake of doctrine definition, you know, I'm going to cover it from what anyone would label more of an expert, being that they have a degree, you know, behind this information. But this doesn't mean they can get by on emotional neglect, because emotionally immature parents see their internalizing children as better able to take care of themselves. They allow these independent children to have more of a life outside the family. But even though internalizers can cope more independently, they still long to connect with their parents and capture their interest. Being emotionally invisible is not okay for any child, especially sensitive and emotionally attuned internalizers. As they grow up, emotionally neglected internalizers continue to feel they should do everything on their own. And they are often quite adept at this. And that's because they're used to it, because, this has been a long progression of not trying to worry or bother or extend, their extreme hurt to others. They feel guilty of how they feel. Like, it's their fault. You know what I'm saying? So because internalizers like to learn and remember experiences, they're able to store up whatever they do get from others, helping them go a long time between moments of attention and affection. Using their excellent emotional memory, they can turn within themselves when they aren't getting much nurturance from others. Because internalizers routinely take on so much responsibility for others, they're deeply grateful for even the smallest bit of recognition. They're more givers than receivers. You know what I'm saying? Externalizers want to receive more than give. In fact, this is one of the hallmarks of an internalizer, an almost over-the-top gratitude for any kind of recognition or special affection. Emotional immaturity in parents guarantees that their children will experience significant emotional neglect. However, this emotional deprivation is often a silent and invisible experience for children. These children will feel the emptiness but won't know what to call it. They'll grow up suffering from emotional loneliness but won't know what's wrong. They'll just feel different from people who seem truly at ease. Again, the self-sufficiency of internalizing children tends to create the impression that they have no needs. They're expected to be okay and get along without anyone watching over them carefully. They may be characterized as old souls, with their parents counting on them to do the right thing. They willingly oblige, playing a role that's overly self-reliant, which often leads to an adult life with overextending themselves for others. Because they're givers more than takers. Children who had to become tough and handle things on their own may develop a rejecting attitude toward their own feeling. Let me read that again, because I just had the deepest of a remembered connection to that sentence. Children who had to become tough and handle things on their own may develop a rejecting attitude toward their own feeling. Perhaps they learned to keep distance from painful feelings they knew their emotionally immature parent couldn't help them with. Another form of neglect occurs when emotionally immature parents give such superficial comfort that they aren't at all helpful to a scared child. You know what I'm saying? Giving them toys, any kind of lavishing gift, but not like a hug, embrace, some form of a deep embrace, some form of a lingual comfortableness, in exchange of conversation to soothe the child into feeling wanted. Emotional neglect can make premature independence feel like a virtue. Many people who were neglected as children don't realize that their independence was a necessity, not a choice. Like they thought, they chose to be that, but the reality is, since they had such a neglectful parent, like it was necessary for them, to act extremely or learn an extreme level, or so they thought, an extreme level of independence. But in general, they just had to think and act in a more independent nature than their level of maturity or advancement, is at the moment. You know what I'm saying? They have to be beyond their years, simply put. Unfortunately, children who become so independent may not learn how to ask for help later in life when it's readily available. You know what I'm saying? All these suggestions, or when for me, I'll be honest, when I started to develop these extreme addiction issues, to tell people that I had a problem and needed help, felt extremely shameful, and I was extremely reluctant to reach out to someone else, thinking that I could handle it. But realistically, I knew I couldn't handle it. But to bother someone else felt more disrespectful, to try to use someone else's support. That's how I would think of it, because I was in such despair. It often falls to psychotherapists or other counselors to coax these people into accepting their need for help as legitimate. Because internalizers look within themselves for reasons why things go wrong, they may not always recognize abuse for what it is. If parents don't label their own behavior as abuse, their child won't label it that way either. That goes into that mirroring that I know we was talking about in the introduction, and I was throwing some gems to my cuz back in South Carolina, because she been paying attention. So what's up, cuz? And I was telling her about the mirroring, you know what I'm saying? Because whoever these children are around a lot, or so-called idolize, like they mimic that behavior, believing that is what strength represents. So again, because internalizers look within themselves for reasons why things go wrong, they may not always recognize abuse for what it is. If parents don't label their own behavior as abuse, their child won't label it that way either. Even as adults, many people have no idea that what happened to them in childhood was abuse. My dad still won't admit that he neglected and abused us, you know what I'm saying? But that's another story. As a result, they may not recognize abuse behavior in their adult relationships. So this passes on to the child this passes on when the child becomes an adult and then practice the same behavior in return to their children or the people around them. You know what I'm saying? Internalizers put a lot of emotional work into their family relationships. As a reminder, emotional work involves using empathy, foresight, and self-control to foster relationships and get along well with others. In healthy families, parents do most of the emotional work with their children, but when parents aren't coping well, an internalizing child often steps into the parenting gap. This may take the form of being overly responsible, such as caring for younger siblings, when parents are swamped with a crisis. Or it could mean paying attention to everyone else's feelings to see who's upset and needs to be calmed down. They're always working on trying to fix others as opposed to fixing themselves. Especially when parents are depressed or emotionally flat, internalizing children may take on a cheerful, lighthearted role, trying to bring happiness and liveliness into an otherwise somber family climate. With their liveliness and good sense of humor, they help others feel that things aren't so bad. They're so busy giving to others, but what are they receiving back? If nothing, eventually that is going to erode and damage deep within that particular individual. Eventually. Emotionally, and that's because you have to, replenish, that emotional nourishment back within yourself that you're giving out towards others. You have to receive it back in order to continue to willingly share with others. You have to replenish back within. So you're always in having to be able to give out. Emotionally immature parents avoid emotional work if they can. As a result, they may not deal with their children's emotional or attention problems or difficulties at school. Wow. Let me read this again because I was just speaking to someone specific in a closer relation about this. Just yesterday and the day before, emotionally immature parents avoid emotional work if they can. As a result, they may not deal with their children's emotional or attention problems or difficulties at school, leaving the children to flounder on their own. When their children need emotional support, these parents are especially unhelpful. For example, they may be dismissive when their child feels hurt or rejected by peers. Instead of trying to understand their child's social predicament, they toss out useless or flippant advice. Ultimately, children learn that these parents simply won't do any emotional work to help them with their hurt feelings. Furthermore, internalizers' natural sensitivity prompts them to do emotional work for their parents. Sometimes the internalizing child's emotional work even extends to parenting the parent, listening to them, offering reassurance, and even giving advice. It's almost like the parent would state that the child is their best friend. Instead of being the parent, you're being the needy friend. Where the child is being the parent, or more of so-called the mature foundation or moral compass. These children can get roped into playing the role of emotional support person long before they're mature enough to do so. Worse, sometimes a parent dumps painful emotional issues on a child, but then brushes off any advice the child tries to give. A role reversal that can continue long into adulthood. In addition to being a no-win situation, this demands excessive emotional work from the child. Many internalizing children optimistically believe that when they grow up, they'll be able to single-handedly love another person into a good relationship. And I'm thinking of it as, trying to save someone because someone is in such despair and hurt and pain. You're trying to play the hero to their life and absorbing a lot of their inefficiency and just depleting yourself because you're not even complete yourself. You know what I'm saying? They don't have enough to give back to you in order for you to replenish yourself full enough to continue to give at the extended level that you are used to. You know, you're going to get emotionally worn out and beat down. Internalizers are accustomed to supplying most of the empathy and doing more than their fair share in trying to get along, and for a long time they may not notice that they're getting worn out while the other person isn't changing at all. I promise you, I did not read that ahead. Internalizers sometimes take up emotional slack by playing both parts in their interactions with people. They act as if there's reciprocity when there isn't. For instance, in other words, they think, or they're being convinced that it's being reciprocated as far as, you know, an equal playing field of that relationship. But in reality, you're being taken for more that's being given back to you. For instance, they might thank someone for being patient when they are actually the ones being inconvenienced. Or they might repeatedly reach out to self-centered people with a thoughtfulness they never get back. They are so familiar with supplying the sensitivity that was missing in their family members or friends or people that they automatically do this with everyone. They make up for other people's lack of engagement by seeing them as nicer and more considerate than they really are. And it's really just feeling so much sympathy, you know, towards that person. Feeling sorry for them. You know what I'm saying? Why do internalizers so often end up in lopsided relationships where they do more than their fair share of the emotional work? One reason is that needy externalizers tend to pursue warm and giving internalizers. Initially, they make the internalizer feel special in order to secure the relationship, but once they have that person, they stop doing the emotional work of reciprocating. The internalizers are surprised at this turnaround and often blame themselves. From an early age, hold up, let's go back. Let me take this sip of water first. Why do internalizers so often end up in lopsided relationships where they do more than their fair share of the emotional work? Answer. One reason is that needy externalizers tend to pursue, and that's intent, because they know what they're doing and why, you know. One reason, again, is that needy externalizers, selfish people, tend to pursue warm and giving internalizers. Initially, they make the internalizer feel special in order to secure the relationship, but once they have the person, they stop doing the emotional work of reciprocating. The internalizers are surprised at this turnaround and often blame themselves. From an early age, internalizers can seem so self-contained that emotionally immature people can't resist leaning on them. They know who these people are as far as internalizers, the externalizers do. And they intentfully use these internalizers and suck them dry of their emotional help without giving it back. Internalizers are so perceptive and sensible that even people they've never met before may instinctively trust them in a stressful situation. I mean, these internalizers always come off as so trustworthy, you know, because they're not going to, leak out your information. They're so supportive, so they're the type of people that you could confide in, you know what I'm saying? Because they're not even trying to leak their own problems out. So they're not going to leak your problems out, most likely. Many internalizers subconsciously believe that neglecting oneself is a sign of being a good person because you're so focused on helping other people. You're way less thinking about you needing help. You feel embarrassed, that you would use someone else for emotional support. When self-absorbed parents make excessive claims on their children's energy and attention, they teach them that self-sacrifice is the worthiest ideal, a message that internalizing children are likely to take very seriously. These children don't realize that their self-sacrifice has been pushed to unhealthy levels due to their parents' self-centeredness. Sometimes these parents use religious principles to promote self-sacrifice, making their children feel guilty for wanting anything for themselves. In this way, religious ideas that should be spiritually nurturing are instead used to keep idealistic children focused on taking care of others. They make them feel guilty for also needing emotional security because the other person is these externalizers, to be most specific, are most focused on what they need without giving back to someone else. They're users instead of givers. Children don't inherently know how to protect their energies. They must be taught how to engage in good self-care, something that happens when adults pay attention to their needs and reinforce the fact that they need rest, sympathy, and respect. For example, sensitive parents teach their children to notice and identify their fatigue instead of making them feel anxious and lazy for needing to rest. Unfortunately, emotionally immature parents are so self-focused that they don't notice when their children are getting overwhelmed or trying too hard. They're more likely to take advantage of a child's sensitive, caring nature rather than protect the child from overusing it. And if parents don't teach their children about good self-care in adulthood, those children won't know how to keep a healthy emotional balance between their needs and the needs of others. This is especially the case with internalizers. Because of their attunement to others, they can get so focused on other people's issues that they lose sight of their own needs and overlook how emotional drain is harming them. In addition, they are secretly convinced that more self-sacrifice and emotional work will eventually transform their unsatisfying relationships. So the greater the difficulties, the more they try. They feel like, of course, they have to try harder to help these people, hoping that in helping them, they'll eventually reciprocate back. But as we've been reading and following, that's never the end game. If this seems illogical, remember that these healing fantasies are based on a child's ideas about how to make things better. As children, internalizers tend to take on the role self of rescuer, feeling a responsibility to help others even to the point of self-neglect. Their healing fantasy always involves the idea, it's up to me to fix this. What they can't see is that they've taken on a job nobody has ever pulled off. changing people who aren't seeking to change themselves. It's hard for internalizers to give up the fight to be loved, but sometimes they eventually realize that they can't single-handedly change how another person relates to them. They finally feel resentment and begin to withdraw emotionally. When an internalizer ultimately does give up, the other person may be caught off guard, since the internalizer had continued to reach out and try to connect for so long. Internalizers are highly perceptive and extremely sensitive to other people. Because of their strong need to connect, growing up with an emotionally immature parent is especially painful for them. Internalizers have strong emotions but shrink from bothering other people, making them easy for emotionally immature parents to neglect. They develop a role self that's overly focused on other people, along with a healing fantasy that they can change others' feelings and behaviors towards them. They get by on very little support from others and end up doing too much emotional work in their relationships, which can lead to resentment and exhaustion. And that is the end of that chapter. And our next chapter, when we continue, is titled Breaking Down and Awakening. And that's chapter 7. Oh man, I love covering this information, and I hope that all of you wonderful people enjoy receiving it as much as I love to give it. You know, I anticipate and hope for these moments to be available a whole lot sooner to record. But I have to be realistic, and in understanding extended time and moments, then I don't overwhelm myself emotionally by feeling an extreme disappointment by not keeping my own particular schedule to sharing with all of you, again, self-loving and worthy audience members. You know what I'm saying? And that's my personal fight as an internalizer, is don't feel like you're not fulfilling towards others. You know, when you're able to drop this recorded show, then that moment is when it's supposed to be, and it will be accepted and appreciated, you know, and watched, you know. So just focus on the things that you're doing, because it's not like something unimportant is disallowing for you to do something so supportive into trying to help an extended audience. You know what I'm saying? Because I do so much work within my home base, and that should and will be, you know, my primary attention. And this is just paying it forward. And whenever I'm able to, and as much as I'm able to do this, I will. If I'm able to do 2 recordings in a week, then I will do that, and then have it saved in succession to be able to drop every week. But on that note, again, I would like to say thank you. You know, we're up to 39 followers right now, and I'm hoping to reach that 40, 50. If I could get 50 followers, that would be beautiful. Anyone that does follow, please share this with anyone that you think would embrace this information. You know what I'm saying? please pay it forward and have them follow this program. You know what I'm saying? So we could change our projection of thinking with someone that is extremely empathetic, because I was any one of you before I am who I am now. And I always say, jokingly but seriously, outside of this platform, if a scumbag like me could do it, you definitely could do it, because I know how much damage that I did to others and how much damage was done to me and how deep my pain resonated, not only within myself, but outside, extended to others close enough to me to where that residual damage wound up detrimenting those individuals for a good moment of time. Directly after, my immature incidents in that before existence of myself. So let me just drop it on that note and say first, this is your neighborhood sensei Fouché. And at first, I always strongly suggest, before emphatically imploring for all of you beautiful, wonderful, self-loving, worthy individuals, to stay woke. Don't let them put you to sleep. You know what I'm saying? And in the meantime, never get all stressed out. You know what I'm saying? Take any meditative practices and procedures, including environmental change, if and when necessary, in order to relax. And like Sensei Fouché, because this is the next chapter, always be prepared. And there goes my bookmark. But always be prepared to take those notes. Be smooth in unity. One.